just any thoughts on like how those two things kind of cross
Well,
correlate?
this is why I think the Kabbalistic Tree of Life is one of the best ways. It's probably the better way to conceptualize the whole theurgic model, because I don't know if you can see, but you've got Malkuth here where we start in Earth, right? And then you've got Yesod that corresponds to Levana, the moon. We know that spatially we're moving upward and outward. But this path here that connects them, the path of Tau, that's the underworld. So to get from the earth to the moon, in the modern Kabbalistic kind of correspondence, to move upward, you have to go downward, inward first. There's a couple of things there. You've got, right, the whole V.I.T.R.I.O.L of the alchemist, visita interiora terra, visit the interior of the earth. Rectificando invenis occultum lapidem, and therein rectifying you will find the hidden stone. Now there's a part where the theurgist must go inward. The soul must enter inward. You go, and I talked about this with Elliot Saxon on the last podcast I did with him for Brave New History. You go inward first to begin the ascent. And so that's something I've really worked out just by practical experience, which is really important. You have to enter the underworld of what we call like the astral. You close your eyes, meaning you shut out this world, and you recede into interiority, because what's traveling is not the body. What's traveling is the soul, right? These guys didn't think they were getting on actual chariots and spaceships and riding out, to the moon and to the sun. It was an analogy, but they probably did think that their soul was traveling to these places, using the imaginal faculty, and thereby, right, getting on that level first, getting on a soul level rather than a purely intellectual level, dissociating from the mundane concerns of the world and the little things I have here that remind me of myself. I got that as a gift, and I made that over there. These are all connections I have with the exterior world. I have to shut those things out if I'm going to ascend and leave. And it's a part and parcel of astral travel as well, because we do find, and Danny Newman did a great job in his book on theurgy, theory and practice. He talks about the Orphic and even the Pythagorean katabatic descent that precedes Socratic philosophy. They were more interested in shamanism. They went inwards first. They didn't even really ascend. They only went into the underworld, and there was a great dark goddess there that they communed with, and they found healing, and they spoke to the spirits of the dead for purposes of divination. But it's later that it's like, oh, we can do more with this spiritual technology than just remain in what modern occultists call the lower astral, the astral realm. You can rise, you can ascend to that mental realm, you can ascend to the higher spiritual realms, and that's that's where that changes. So the going down is actually entering into the astral, which means shutting down the senses, and the locus of your consciousness is now in the imaginal, and that's the activation of psyche, of soul, and it's from there that this thing travels. And there's a whole tradition of the avgoedis, the egg body. They call it the luminous or radiant body. Avgo in Greek means egg.
Is it like the Orphic egg?
Yeah, I mean, it could be related. To me, I mean, modern practitioners call it the body of light.
Oh
They
yeah.
had a whole technique of constructing this astral etheric body that would take them on into immortality without having to sacrifice their waking consciousness. Now that's theurgic. That's also in line with the Merkaba, what the Merkaba mystics were doing.
And okay, so thinking about like this descent terminology in terms of the Merkaba, mysticism of the Hebrews, how could we weigh this up against things like Egyptian funerary texts, like the Book of Gates or the Book of Coming Forth by Day, or things like this? Is there some pretty heavy crossover as well?
Yeah, I think absolutely that time spent in the underworld, it's all talking about the same thing. And the trouble is that it would take another hour for me to explain to people
Yeah.
that might be listening what is happening. A lot of people read this stuff and they're like, okay, they entered the underworld. Like, what do they just like go into a cave and like
Yeah.
what happened? They take hallucinogenic drugs? Well, sometimes, but really the spiritual work as it and we know because it's like we're working this shit now. It's not a dead tradition, it's a living tradition. This stuff is going to continue until the whole fucking shebang's over. It keeps finding its way through. It keeps surviving. But disembodied. So you remember I was talking about how we have that chain of that ontological chain, the henad of the self, of which my physical body is the lowest or densest expression.
Mm-hmm.
Parts of you exist diffused throughout this chain. Now, when you this is and the ancients didn't believe that consciousness was like we say now in the modern vernacular, an emergent property of the physical organ of the brain. They didn't think that. The consciousness was part of what went on. It resided in us for a time and left us when the physical body was not of use. And that's kind of like saying this ontological chain of being descends downward. And then the lowest manifestation is my body. My physical body is the densest. It's the bottom part of that. Okay. When the body dies, the ontological chain is still there. It kind of recedes from the body. It's still there, but its lowest manifestation is no longer present in the world. The physical materia is gone. It's subject to decay. But the ontological, the chain of being, the henad of the self, which descended and animated that body, is still there. And consciousness still exists in that spectrum of low to high. And so it's never gone. It's never gone. When you're alive, you have those aspects of yourself. When you die, you rely on them more. And it can be very confusing for the recently deceased because they didn't take the time in their waking life, in their physical life, to get in touch with those. It's like having different limbs that you didn't even realize you had. And it's like, well, now I got to learn how to move these things. I wish I would have learned them sooner when I was a baby and I could have been coordinated by adulthood. So, that said, disembodied beings have that ontological chain. Disembodied intelligences have that ontological chain, but they're disembodied. They do not possess that lowest, densest manifestation. And we do. And we possess everything, quote unquote, above it. So we meet those disembodied entities at the same level in our own ontological hierarchy of consciousness, which is to say, it is in my imaginal faculty, not imagination, because it's not made up. It's plastic, it's malleable, it's Yetziratic, right? Yetzira meaning formation. It's this thing to be formed, like this raw matter of this blueprint, which will, use the laws of physics in order to construct something by its pre-existent pattern. That's what Yetzira is. It's the blueprint of reality. And so that is really where we meet disembodied spirits, lower entities, chthonic entities, the husks or shells of the dead. You can interact with those things using the same part of the ontological, we call them the planes. You meet them on the astral plane because they don't have anything lower than that. So it's like I exist in that plane with them. in my own ontological chain of being. So what I'm going to do in order to communicate with them, because I can't see them in the physical room typically, especially from somebody who's not developed those faculties, I'm going to shut down the part of me that associates with physicality, and I'm going to recede into the imaginal faculty of my psyche, where I will be able to meet them. Now, the issue is a lot of us have not, there is no form. And what we have to do is we have to use an agreed upon image, usually culled from, the practitioner, our available imagery. It's like images we have here. So you might get like Big Bird talking to you, if you've not trained your mind to preferentially and automatically select an established esoteric symbolic vocabulary, whether that's Hebrew or whether that's the tarot, or whether that's the symbols of the zodiac. Those are packed with information. And so that entity can use that as an astral gateway, as David Rankin calls it. It can use it as this agreed upon image to communicate more about itself to you, because you already understand what that symbol means, rather than just like, this guy's got a head full of junk. He's got memories. He's got TV shows. He's got, who knows what kinky shits in there. How do I appear? How do I get this guy to see me? And some demonic entities, they want you to be scared. And other entities, they want to find the cutest, cuddliest way, because they don't want to scare you by showing you, any of that stuff. So that's really the way in which this is the tradition. This is what it is. When you go inward, you're receding upward in the ontological hierarchy of the henad, the chain of causality of the henad of the self. And you're in that sense, you're toggling your consciousness to a different part of that spectrum.
Is there any correlatives with the Egyptian funerary texts and something like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey? Or do you feel like that's like a different sort of symbolic or archetypal or mythological story? I don't
I
really
think,
remember all the details to it, but I do remember there's like a descent into the underworld type thing.
yeah. Apollo leads 12 suitors or 12 warriors or something into the underworld. So a couple of different ways of looking at it. The funerary texts were, I think they dealt with more purely what we were talking about in the underworld, and how to survive because they were for the pharaoh, and the whole job of the priest class that ministered to the pharaoh, like, because he was a god, so he had his own priests, because each priest was a devotee of a particular god. Pharaoh was god. He has his own attending priests. And their job was to make sure that he survived the afterlife, which means when the lowest portion of his ontological chain of being died, his body, that he knew how to ascend upward towards the henad of the self. Or in a lot of instances, they tried to keep the fucker alive. It was like etheric vampirism. They put him they put his ka in a statue that looked like him in life, and they would feed it food and stuff like that. So there's a little bit of a wonky thing happening there, etheric vampirism, but I think that's more the underworld they were dealing with specifically in the funerary text. Whereas in Homer, there are certain interpretations, which again, Danny Newman does a great job talking about in his book. The underworld is often code for, not even code. I don't want to make it sound like, fucking InfoWars here. But it's just the way they thought differently. They did. We like to think that, Game of Thrones and all those shitty shows do a great job at making us feel like humans have thought and acted with the same motivations and the same states of mind. They haven't. It's just a patent fact. There are commonalities, but those are usually the lower parts of ourselves. And these people thought differently. And so when Porphyry points it out, anytime you see a cave or the underworld in like the Homeric stuff, right? He talks about it on his commentary on the Cave of the Nymphs from one of the books of Homer's Iliad. He talks about when you see Homer talking about, or in the ancient literature generally, you see him talking about a cavern, they're really talking about manifestation. They're talking about the material plane. So the underworld in a lot of those texts was where we are now. It wasn't in the earth. It wasn't actually chthonic. It was from a philosophical interpretation. It was talking about physical incarnation into the body.
Wow. Yeah, I've got a copy of Newman's book on the way, so I'm looking forward to reading what he's got to say about that. Sounds really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I've talked about it, on earlier episodes. To me, the best example of that is in the myth of Hades and Persephone. That's the best. That's the clearest example, and that's exactly why that was the myth that was covered in the Eleusinian Mysteries.
This is probably the best part to ask you. What is Osirification?
Well, let's look at it in terms of really you find that word most commonly used, or you probably would have heard me use it in the context of an initiatic ritual. And it's essentially the Osirification of the candidate, which is the ritualized, it's symbolic, but it's not just symbolic. There's also something that's happening by way of this formula. Because when we work ritual, there are certain things that we do in our physical bodies, the lowest part of that ontological chain of being, and there are things that we're doing at higher sections of that chain. And so that's where the magic is taking place on the higher levels of cognizance or consciousness. And so it's not just symbolic. But if you were to see it symbolically, it would look like a candidate being bound, and or in some way the candidate is symbolized as having died. So there's lots of ways you can do that. You could put him in a room with skull and crossbones. You could put him in a coffin, hopefully spacious. You could tie them. I'm not talking about anything cruel or kinky here, but you just symbolically kind of put a rope around their, bind their hands or something, or bind them around the waist. And usually darkness, blackness, that is something that is employed to symbolize death. And on another level, there are certain ritual accoutrements which are separate. They're individual items that at that point, or a point around that point, when the candidate has been bound and symbolically dead, that those things, even though they're separate items, they're kind of in the same area, they're then moved, they're separated, and like in the same way that Osiris was cut into a bunch of pieces and spread all over Egypt, right? He died. His brother Tifon Set, or Set, puts him in a coffin and then sails him down the Nile. And then I believe he's rescued, and Set's like, okay, not happening again, cuts him up into a bunch of pieces and casts his limbs to the winds, spreads them all over Egypt. Symbolically, an initiation, particularly an initiation that is alchemical, this refers to the taking apart of what Kabbalists would call the Ruach, the lower Ruach. A Jungian might call it the psyche. you are taking apart symbolically and ceremonially the constituent components of the psyche of the candidate, their self, lowercase s. And then from there, you don't just leave them that way. That would, they're at a very vulnerable state at that point, because it's, there are certain forces that are being dissolved, but ultimately they're brought back together, at least in our tradition, in the same ceremony. Candidate is almost completely unaware that any of that happened. And from there, the alchemical initiation is catalyzed. It's symbolized that you've died to your old life, and we are taking you apart. The you that you know, not the you that you don't know. The ideal self is the king yet to come. The once and future king, really, of your microcosm. So then you work the alchemical grades, specifically in the Golden Dawn. Each grade is allotted an element, Empedoclean element: earth, air, water, and fire, and it's also attributed to a sephira on the lower portions of the Tree of Life. And so what you do is you're now calling forth to the fore in your sphere of sensation by certain exercises, rote memorizations, and the rituals which catalyze these alchemical sort of stimulations or saturations. You're then now working with the elemental parts of the self, the parts of your psyche that are conveniently grouped into 4 different categories, and that's part of the alchemy. And then you move on when you're ready, and there's different metrics for that, and you integrate these things, and then finally you reassemble them under the auspices of the quintessence spirit, the 5th element, that you little suspected but was there with you the whole time. And that's essentially the Osirification formula.
Beautiful. All right. One last one. So we're talking about things like the preservation of truth, things like this, and transmission of truth throughout a lot of these esoteric currents, largely throughout time. And I had read somewhere or had heard from someone that Frederick Hockley was largely responsible for the preservation of the manuscript of the Golden Chain of Homer. And it's a pretty cool and important book to me personally. And I think I may have heard you mention that name before. So just curious, who was Frederick Hockley?
So Fred Hockley was a Mason in England in the 1800s. Believe it was the early 1800s. It might have been the late 1700s as well. But he was a contemporary of Kenneth Mackenzie, and they worked together very closely. They were both part of a they were both in the sphere of Rosicrucian Masonry of that era, and they both participated in that wonderfully mysterious, short-lived society, the Society of 8. Hockley was somewhat of a mentor and a confidant to Kenneth Mackenzie, although there were instances where they had falling outs. But Hockley was, his main thing from the letters that exist was that he was into scrying. And there were certain very interesting things that he wasn't, and you see this with D. You talk about, it's better well known with D that Edward Kelly was his scryer. Hockley did not scry. He did not have the gift of second sight, unfortunately, but he had housemaids because he had some wealth. He had housemaids, and they were young women, and he preferred that they be virginal young women that did the scrying for him. He would set the apparatus up, and it was very, very important. His spiritual protocols, his spiritual hygiene for the whole thing was super, super important. It was all based in Christian invocation, Christian prayer, certain liturgies that actually resemble exorcisms and stuff like that. And he prepared crystals and scrying mirrors. I think he might have used water too at a certain point. He did a lot of experimenting. Uh, it's interesting that he preserved the golden chain of Homer. I don't recall him having any practical interest in alchemy, but he was definitely an antiquarian. Him and Kenneth Mackenzie as well. They assiduously preserved texts, and that was like their big thing, both of them, uh, following in the shoes of Elias Ashmole. But he's considered very foundational to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He's also kind of his name is thrown in the hat for people who may have drafted or influenced the cipher manuscripts that the Golden Dawn actually, the curriculum and the rituals of the Golden Dawn actually came from. There's a book. It's part of what's by I think they had a bunch of different guest editors. Bob Gilbert was one, Ella Cow was one, but it's called Roots of the Golden Dawn. And some of these books are quite expensive. The one particularly on Westcott, the Magical Magician, the Magical Mason, I think that one's called. It's basically a collection of letters and lectures and private papers from a few different people. And there's one called the Rosicrucian Seer, and those are the private letters of Frederick Hockley to, I think, F.L. Gardner. And so there was a lot of it is just you're sifting through it and you're just kind of like, there's a lot of bullshit here. But some of it is really great. And one of the things, he stands out as somebody who is fairly intrepid. He bottles like a spirit or a demon or something like that. And it's truly terrifying that the thing like comes through the scrying session into physical. But he avers that. But the main thing about Hockley is that he told people repeatedly, don't even bother. Don't do this stuff. It's too dangerous. He was very paranoid about demonic influence and demonic. He didn't want to commune with them. So his spiritual protocols are very, very rigorous. They're very, very Christian. But at the end of the day, and he didn't do any of the scrying. But at the end of the day, he did tell people, he's like, it's really not worth it. This stuff is too dangerous. He continued to do it.
Interesting. All right. That was awesome. Do you have any last notes or thoughts that you want to leave people on?
Well, we covered a shitload of ground, even for us.
I
So
know.
yeah, that was great. I don't know. I'm getting close to finishing up this book. Right now, it's going to be called A Formless Fire: Rediscovering
Ooh,
the Magical Traditions of
that's
the
a
West.
good name.
Yeah, I got it from it's a variation of something in the Chaldean oracles. Uh but also Algisus Divinis. And I didn't even realize this until after I selected the name. But Algus Divinis actually writes, I think, in Philosophy as a Rite of Rebirth, or it might have been one of his books on Orphism, but he says that the name that they used for Hecate in the to refer to Hecate kind of esoterically in the Chaldean oracles was by calling her the formless fire.
Whoa, that's badass. And are you, can you say or not, are you having Travis do the artwork for some of that stuff?
Yeah. He's excited to do it. He's slated to do it. We've not um so he's got some stuff. He's putting his art in a gallery at the beginning of this month, or next month, February. So he's focusing on that. And I'm going to California for PRS and speaking at Saddleback Laguna Lodge in California, down there. But so we're gonna really get on it, and by mid-February, I hope to have the book completely into the publisher, and then it's kind of on it's on him from there to give me notes and edit. But the thing is, like, we've been going, whereas like with the other manuscript to the real big publisher that you helped me on doing the diagrams and stuff, I sent that whole thing in because that's how they wanted it, and now they're reading it. So that was a long time to not have any guidance. whereas now with my editor now, I think everybody's kind of aware, it's Jake. I send him a chapter and he sends me notes. So that's a much more manageable way to do that. But I understand that over at the larger publisher, who I'm not going to mention yet. I know I've said it in the past, but I just, how these things go. Like, until the deal is sealed, don't say anything. So, with the larger publisher, I understand that, like, it's just a bigger machine. So they have to do it that way. But yeah, Travis is going to be involved. Travis Lawrence, I love his artwork. He is the guy for Tria Prima. He did Angels in Vermilion, by Danny Newman. He did Nate Schick's, the art for Nate Schick's book, The Grand Communication, and hopefully I'm next in line.
Beautiful. Awesome. So excited. All right, brother. Well, another one down. Appreciate you. And thank you, everybody, for listening and tuning in and all of your support. Till next time.